You whispering my name, thinking I won't be the same. Turn fiction into fact. See what you didn't know, bruises that I'll never show, slipping on your every jab. So tighten up your fist, step into the ring with this. I hope your mama's got your back. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. Just 'cause I took a break, you're making a huge mistake, thinking you can take the throne. Look at you trembling, step into the lion's den. Bet you wish you stayed at home, begging for mercy underneath your breath when I ain't even sweating. Yeah, my legend's written in the stone. Yeah, you're crying age in defeat is now your only friend. Even your mama's gotta know. First round, you thought you would've knocked me down. Fifth round, bleeding out the side of your mouth. Final round, pulling the sound of my name in the crowd. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 oh. You hit a buzz. Oh, 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 First round, fifth round, final round. Oh, oh, oh.
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Suter, and with me today is 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿𝐷ring. 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿𝐷ring, how are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. We're still struggling with the whole COVID thing, but we're doing all right. I've been looking forward to today's episode for a while, ever since it was first proposed by a friend of mine, and we've been sort of talking and planning it. In March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, ostensibly to destroy Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and to end the brutal regime of the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein. But even as the war started, there were a lot of questions about the real motives of the United States in invading that country. In the winter of 2003, Bush told French President Jacques Chirac that Gog and Magog were at work rampaging through the Middle East. Chirac had absolutely no clue what this meant. Neither did I. And ended up having to ask his deputies to find someone to explain it to them. They finally found someone in the upper levels of the French government, and who explained that Gog and Magog are, according to the Old Testament, this was by vis-a-vis Professor Romer of the University of Lausanne. It was a biblical prophecy in Ezekiel where the two threaten Israel until war is launched against them. And in Christian Zionism, of which Bush certainly dabbles, this can be interpreted as the war which heralds the coming of Jesus and the end times. Now, there were, in fact, many other reasons given for the war in Iraq. Yes, Saddam Hussein was a terrible person who gassed 10,000 northern Kurds, his own people. But, that had happened 10 years prior to this, and we did nothing at the time, probably hoping that nobody would point out the fact that we were one of the countries who gave them that gas in the first place. We only cared 10 years later when we were looking to invade. Meanwhile, there was mass genocide occurring in Darfur, the rape, torture, and ethnic cleansing of the Western Sudanese people. As many as 10,000 people a week were dying. Why invade one country to avenge the deaths of 10,000 people who died 10 years ago, when we could invade another country and save the lives of 500,000 more? Don't know, but we went into Iraq instead of Darfur. 9/11 happened. I guess maybe that's why. We had to invade to stop terrorism, to fight despotism and tyranny. Well, despite all his faults, and believe me, there were more faults than positive attributes in the man, Saddam Hussein had one of the most liberal regimes in the Middle East. The 1970 Iraqi Provisional Constitution, drafted by Hussein's dreaded Ba'ath Party, granted women the right to vote, to attend school, to own property, even to hold political office. Iraq was one of the first countries to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. By 1975, 15% of all civil servants in Iraq were women. 25% were lab techs, 31% were medical professionals. Never saw an Iraqi woman in a burqa, did you? Women had more rights in Iraq than in nearly any other Middle Eastern country. Things were continuing to improve for women in Iraq until the Iraq War. Since the Iraq War, women have been removed from nearly every role in government agencies, and they've been restricted on working outside the home or on traveling. Honor killings have skyrocketed, and women's literacy dropped from a high of 75% in 1987 to less than 25% the last year we could actually measure it. Not one of the 9/11 hijackers were affiliated with Iraq in any way. Meanwhile, the royal house of Saud has a brutal, murderous regime that oppresses its own people and butchers dissidents, like Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Executions, torture, no free speech. Women finally got the right to vote 3 years ago in Saudi Arabia, and even then, it's still basically impossible for them to do. The royal house of Saud remains in power only because we sell them the weapons they need to do so, and believe me, they pay through the nose for it. And they also use their OPEC veto power favorably for the United States. The royal house of Saud and this positive OPEC veto power has given us some of the cheapest prices for oil of any country in the world, and was the single biggest reason for the economic boom of the 90s. Sorry, Clinton fans, it wasn't Clinton. He didn't hurt for the most part, but it was the oil. Meanwhile, our willingness to ally with this terrible regime was one of the reasons that a young Saud by the name of Osama bin Laden decided to wage war on the United States, and why 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Again, not one from Iraq. Saddam Hussein's regime was so liberal that bin Laden had repeatedly tried to kill Hussein, and in no small part for the heresy of letting women vote. After his jihad on the U.S. was over, bin Laden said his next goal would be to kill Hussein and to overthrow him and put in a proper caliphate. Hussein was... Oh, so hold on one second. Hussein wanted bin Laden dead almost as much as we did. And he was, up until the invasion, a major source of intelligence for us on Osama bin Laden. He was a genuine ally for us in the region when it came to the war on terror. He had no interest in terror and was embroiled in far more problems with his conflict in Iran. He was no threat to the United States, even if he did triple the number of rubber bands on his Scud missile launchers. Well, he was hiding weapons of mass destruction, so we had to go in for that reason, even though He wouldn't use them against us, couldn't use them against us, and we might be able to give them to a country that would. Well, UN weapons inspectors said that Saddam Hussein had largely complied with the inspections, and they did not believe that any illegal weapons of mass destruction existed in Iraq. The CIA echoed the sentiment. The Downing Street memo, notes from a secret meeting of senior Bush officials, cited the head of Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, as saying that Bush simply wanted to remove Saddam Hussein through military action and was looking for any justification to do that after the fact. He said that the intelligence and facts were, quote, being fixed around the policy. And Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said that the case for the invasion was thin, but it was clear Bush had already made up his mind and would go anyway. They warned Tony Blair to stay out of it, that it was illegal and that there was no justification. Instead, he supported the war. But the best case against us having any interest in weapons of mass destruction when it came from Iraq is for a very simple, often misunderstood and misquoted, yet completely undeniable fact. At the time of the invasion, Iraq did have a significant number of weapons of mass destruction. On April 3rd of 1991, just after the conclusion of Desert Storm, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 687 concerning the restoration of peace and security in Iraq and Kuwait. As part of this resolution, Iraq was forced to, and agreed to, declare and account for all of its WMDs, again, in no small part contributed to by us, and to either destroy them or turn them over to the UN. Not having the ability to safely dispose of these weapons, Iraq opted to surrender them to the United Nations. The United Nations was no more capable at that time of destroying these weapons. So what they did was they took all of these weapons and placed them in bunkers in Iraq under UN seal. All of these sites, such as Bukarat, Muthana, Al-Qaqa, all contained highly illegal, high-powered explosives and as many as 2,500 warheads armed with sarin gas, as well as other banned chemicals and explosive weapons. They were secured in place using a simple plastic O-ring and just regular caution tape, and a single UN observer, unarmed, with the mission not to protect these stockpiles, but simply observe against tampering and make sure that Iraq was keeping and recognizing the fact that these weapons, while still in Iraq, belonged to the UN and had been properly surrendered and maintained in UN custody. Since accounting for all of its WMDs, the U.S. continually asserted that, without evidence or corroboration, that and also, by the way, I might add, contrary to the findings of the inspectors and intelligence agencies of the U.S. and its European allies, that the declaration was in fact incomplete and that Saddam Hussein had kept a number of WMDs undeclared and in his possession and ready for use. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq with the goal of removing these secret hidden WMDs, which, if they fell into the wrong hands, could be used against the United States. As the invasion began, the UN observers, which had been monitoring these declared WMD sites, evacuated. They left and turned custody over to the United States. They informed the United States where every one of these sites were and what the inventory was of all of these sites, although this information was actually already public knowledge. Find it on the interwebs, and the UN already had a catalog of it, and the U.S., as a member of the Security Council, already knew. Nonetheless, they made sure to inform the U.S. and to say that perhaps somebody should secure these sites. Marines in the 101st Airborne, aware of all of this, spent a night at the Muthana site in Iraq. They failed to secure or even inspect any of the weapons of mass destruction at the site in Iraq in which the Marines were staying, and instead continued on their, quote, lightning war into Baghdad. 6 months later, not one of the known, declared, legal WMD storage sites had been secured. And a year after that, we had secured less than half of them. Sarin and mustard gas, IEDs used in chemical attacks from Muthana, were deployed against U.S. troops starting in May 17th of 2004. Over 377 tons of high-explosive HMX was looted from Al-Qaqa, and another 5,000 to 1,000 tons from Bukharat, making up the vast majority of the explosives used by the insurgency against U.S. troops. The very thing we had gone to prevent: weapons of mass destruction being used against Americans. By comparison, it's worth noting the vast majority of Iraqi oil fields were all secured within the first 4 weeks of the invasion. Why did we go to war in Iraq? WMD's veto power on OPEC to create an ally country in the Middle East to get rich. Was it nation building? Can we even succeed in nation building? Tonight, we're going to get a unique insight into the planning of the Iraq War as we welcome our guest, one of the planners of the invasion, staging for the Fifth Fleet out of Centcom. We will ask him what goes into planning an invasion of an entire country, what his role was, and what, if anything, he learned about the U.S. motives for the invasion by the way it was executed. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming retired Navy Commander Lance McMillan. Commander McMillan, thank you for joining us.
Hi, good to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Back to the show. So obviously you're a slow learner. You came once and you're like, oh, I'll do that again. And you and 𝐒𝐤𝐬𝐿𝐷ring have become simpatico. Oh my God, I show up and you guys are all loving on each other. Yeah, okay. So, Commander, if you could please.
The rest of us call that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, touche. All right. Well, thank you for coming back to the show. So, could you tell us a little bit about your military career leading up to the invasion of Iraq?
Sure. I joined the Navy in 1980 and retired in 2005. During that time, I had 12 years of sea duty and 8 extended deployments. I specialized primarily in amphibious operations and operational logistic planning. I attended the Naval War College and the Joint Staff and Command College and was a fully accredited Joint Services Officer. Immediately prior to 9/11, I had been, serving on the Pacific Fleet's amphibious readiness group. And in that position, I had the job of being the maritime pre-positioning force and amphibious logistics lead planner. Most of the other people were concerned with, conducting exercises and making sure repairs are being done on ships. I was kind of the forgotten bastard stepchild stuffed in the corner because, you're never going to be used. We're never going to go to war. And if we do, we're never going to need you because it's all just about us invading and bombing things. It turned out right before all this stuff started, in preparation for the invasion, I transferred to a Coast Guard liaison position up in San Francisco. I'd been gone about 3 months, and then one day my Coast Guard admiral got a call from my former CO, the admiral in charge of the amphibious group, and he said, I hate to do this, but we need to have Lance back. He's the only man who knows the recipe of how to do this going to war with joint logistics stuff. So a deal was brokered, and off I went. I was sent to Fifth Fleet in Bahrain as the amphibious and maritime pre-positioning force liaison coordinator, and assigned to their long-range planning cell there to assist in preparations. And that would have been probably in the vicinity of September of 2002, I think.
All right, so September '02, you get a call, and that thereabouts. You get a call saying, "Hey, guess what? Looks like we may actually need some logistics for war planning." I do want to get into what the responsibility was and what they asked you to do in a second. But you had said that you were, whether you used the word liaison, I forget what you said, but you were like an envoy. So just because I think it's fascinating. Right before we go on, this was where you were actually working with law enforcement officials, both from the U.S. and abroad, to coordinate military and law enforcement. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, it's an organization called Joint Interagency Task Force. There are two of them, one in the Atlantic and Caribbean and the other one in the Pacific Indian Ocean area. And I was assigned to the one in the western side. And their primary job is coordinating military support to domestic and international law enforcement in primarily, but not exclusively, counter-narcotics interdiction.
All right, so you're in the middle of doing that. You get a call, and they want you to plan for this war. So what was your, first of all, what were your responsibilities? What was it they were asking you to do? And what was your mindset going in? What did you think about this?
I have to take a step back to correct what you just said.
Please.
I wasn't necessarily planning the war. The war had already been planned. Most areas that the U.S. anticipates there's going to be a conflict, they already have pre-prepared operational plans on file for those things.
Mm-hmm.
And as tensions heat up or the balloon goes up, you break those big publications out and you say, okay, how do we need to change this to accommodate all the immediate differences between what's happening and what we thought would happen? And then you deviate from that plan based on that. So I'd been the guy who went to all the planning conferences where they'd constantly, on a 3-year cycle, update every one of these plans. And so I was very familiar with it. I toured all the port sites that we would likely be using and so forth.
So basically, every war that the U.S. could, realistically maybe be forced to fight in the next 10 years or so, roughly, we have planned out already. We're like, this is how we're going to do it. And then if it looks like it may actually come true, we end up grabbing those plans and starting from there and saying, okay, let's what do we do in adapting? But they've already got a basic plan in place. Is that roughly accurate?
Yeah, pretty much. That's pretty much the case.
All right.
The military excels at having plans for everything.
Oh, yes. And the key thing is they will tell you is the moment you go into action, the first thing you do is throw the plan away.
So they got a plan. What was your job?
So my job, when I'd been assigned at the amphibious group, I was the Maritime Prepositioning Force and Joint Logistics over the Shore Planer. So let me explain what those two things are. Maritime Prepositioning Force is the fact that the Marines and the Army have these as well, and we worked with the Army with theirs, have small flotillas of ships. These are large roll-on, roll-off, and container ships that have pre-staged sets of equipment, typically for a very large reinforced brigade-sized unit. And for the area that we're going to be talking about, that set is staged in 𝐒𝐢𝐜𝐴 Garcia, which is a tiny island in the middle of nowhere in the Indian Ocean. So the plan for Maritime Prepositioning Force is that when things get hot, preferably before they get hot, you sail that force to a port in the area so you can offload that equipment. There's no personnel on those ships. What they do is they take people from, in this case, Camp Pendleton in California, load them on airplanes, fly them over to the country in question. They get off the planes. They take buses out to wherever you're offloading the equipment. They get in the equipment and drive out and get ready to fight. So in theory, you can have a fully operational heavy brigade in place within about a week to 2 weeks, depending on conditions. So that's pre-positioning force. Joint logistics over the shore is the other part. And that is where if you don't have access to a port that you can use for offloading, it's all this pre-stage stuff, again, aboard ships, but these aren't pre-staged out in distant locations like Dave Garcia. They're actually back in the United States somewhere. And these are not Navy ships. These are United States Naval Service ships. So they're crewed by civilians, but they are owned by the Navy. And those would be alerted. They sail to the site and they take this stuff and essentially build a port on a beach somewhere. So it'll have a big pier, it'll have underwater pipelines for offloading fuel, it has cranes for offloading containers from ships, and so on and so on. It's an extremely complicated operation and very specialized. So there are only a couple of units that know how to do this stuff. And my job was to, while I was at the Amphibious Ready Group, my job was to coordinate with the Army to do joint logistics over the shore exercises. We'd do one of these a year. We'd meet, the Army would bring some of their toys, we'd bring our toys, everybody would play around and we'd offload the stuff over a beach. The time that I was at the command, we did one in Australia, we did one in Korea, we did one in California. The plans were to, also do them, for example, up in the Aleutian Islands, so we would be prepared to operate in an Arctic environment, that kind of stuff. You just get a full spectrum of areas that you can operate and do these very complicated operations. So my job was to coordinate these exercises and massage and update all the plans for operating these two things.
All right. So now you said, so basically you could get, you said an entire, did I hear this correctly, a battalion up in about a week or two?
No, a brigade.
Brigade.
So brigade is 3 battalions plus supporting elements, typically.
All right, and then I assume there'd be a need for. Could you also do like airfields? You said you could do like a port, so you could do airfields. So how long would it take, in theory, on average, do you think, to establish in a wartime situation like this, where you're doing an invasion? How long would it take to establish either one of these ports that you just discussed, or an airfield where you could bring in supplies?
Again, about 2 weeks. When we did this for the invasion of Iraq, we didn't necessarily need to do JLOTs because we had access to 3 ports in Kuwait. Now, the Kuwaiti government asked us to not use one of those 3 because it was for their civilian traffic and they didn't want to impact things. But we did get to use the other 2. One of which was the Kuwaiti naval base, which really wasn't configured for offloading, tanks and trucks and containers and everything. So again, part of what I was doing when I got sent to 5th Fleet was coordinating with their engineering services to say, okay, in order to support this buildup of forces, here's what we want improvements made to that base. And so they went in and they prepared, a large concrete landing pad for hovercraft, air-cushioned hovercraft to come in, which could carry tanks from the ships offshore, parking lots for staging equipment, that kind of stuff. And that advanced preparation work to improve that facility probably took about somewhere between 2 to 3 months. I was told, I'm not an engineer and I don't work really closely with those folks, but I was told it was the single largest concrete construction use that had occurred for a single project anywhere in the Gulf region up to that time.
All right. So as you are being asked to help do the advanced work on planning this, what were your immediate concerns? What were the things that you said we have to get solved right away to make sure that we can invade this country?
It's kind of threefold. First, we needed to find out how many ships were coming and when they were going to be arriving, so we could, stagger the arrival times. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that you can't just have 50 ships show up at a port all at the same time and say, "Okay, everybody, get your stuff off," and it gets done. There are only so many available berths to start offloading stuff. There's only so much space in the parking lot to stage stuff and make sure all that the maintenance is done on those preparatory to sending them to the front, gassing them up, arming them, installing pieces of equipment, changing out the batteries, etc. So we had to look at that and stagger those arrival times so we didn't overload the port and have 20, 30 ships anchored off of this place, which the Iraqis would look at as a potential target-rich environment, because all you have to do is fire one 1950s technology, Styx missile, one hit, there goes half of a battalion's worth of equipment down to the bottom of the ocean. So you wanted to have the absolute minimum number of ships going into the port at one time. Plus, you had to arrange, and this is where the Coast Guard, there were about 600 Coast Guard people that were part of the organization that we worked with. They provided port security. So they had little patrol boats and coastal radar sets, and we would use them to monitor to make sure you didn't have underwater swimmers coming in or mine layers and that kind of stuff. So that was a key part of it. And then you have all of these people showing up, and you have to provide, places to sleep, places to eat, the food, the water, bathing facilities for all the people that are necessary to operating the equipment to offload these ships. So that was another thing we had to coordinate is, where are these guys going to sleep? Because the Kuwaiti Naval Base, which was the primary point of debarkation that we were using, really didn't have a lot of space. So, do we set the guys up in tents outside the base? If we do that, then how do we control security? Because the base itself is fenced in and has walls around it. Out in the fields, there's nothing. So, some angry Bedouin who sides with Saddam can come in and do whatever he wants. So all of that had to be factored into the planning. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes a lot of sense. So you were doing this planning, and then as I understand it, you started to encounter some issues. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I think the key is that, as you said in your lead-in comments, we'd all been sold a bill of goods. We'd been led to believe that this was all going to be about, we're going in to, liberate Iraq from the evil oppressive government, and we're going in to ensure there are no WMD that he's going to give to al-Qaeda to attack the United States. And you've got to realize this was an orchestrated propaganda campaign by the Bush administration that had gone on for over a year leading up to all this. And I have it, but I don't want to necessarily read the litany of all these little lies that have been stacking up. They wanted to go to war, regardless of what the cause was, whether it was justified or not. And so we started encountering little bits of pushback that got more and more firm in their nature as the planning process went further and as we moved closer and closer to war. And to give you two examples, one was they really were very concerned about trying to open up the Iraqi port of Qasr, which is near the city of Basra. And Basra was a key part of trying to secure the country and make us look like the good guys, because it was a Shia majority, but not Persian, so they're Arabs. They're not aligned with Iran. And we wanted to make sure that we could get humanitarian relief supplies in there as quick as possible. So we needed to repair 𝐓𝐬𝐴𝐷's port facilities very quickly. And at this point, we'd been looking at various options, and this is after the wars actually started, kicked off. And the amphibious CB battalion, CB is construction battalion, it's a Navy construction engineers who build bases. Anyway, they'd finished doing their offload of the marine equipment, so they were kind of just sitting there and helping the Army offload all their stuff and their supplies at the port. And the battalion commander of the CBs contacted me and said, hey, look, I've got a battalion of people who have their own motor transport, can provide their own security, and know and have all the expertise and supplies to restore that port within about a week or two, as soon as it's, been taken by friendly forces. So why don't you tell them that we can do this rather than what we're doing right now in the planning, which is they figure between 4 to 6 months before we can have that port operational, because we're going to bring in civilian contractors to do the work. So we dutifully, together, the battalion CO and I, wrote up a little letter and sent it forward making this proposal. And within probably 48 hours, we got back a response that essentially said, not only no, but you will never bring this subject up again. And if you do, there will be severe disciplinary consequences.
Really?
And it's important, yeah, and it's important to understand that this response did not come from Fifth Fleet, did not come from Central Command Commander's office. It came from the Office of the Secretary of Defense and was signed by the White House. So you've just skipped multiple layers of command for somebody to say, shut up. And the more we looked into it, the more it became evident that the real issue here was that a no-bid contract had been let to one of Rumsfeld's little side friends to come in once the port was fully secured to do the repairs for something like $750 million to repair this facility, which we again could have done within a week or two for almost no cost. So that tells you a little bit, I think, about motivations of what was really going on for this war.
Yeah, I think people need to understand the role of what the CBs do and how they do it. I mean, they're a complete fighting force that go in and build things in hostile areas.
Yeah.
And they build things so that other fighting forces can come in. I mean, and they're incredibly good at it. It's one of the kind of special forces of the Navy. It's not in with the SEALs and stuff, but they
they're not direct action people, but they're a very specialized organization that does one job and does it exceptionally well. And
they have all of their own support, their own equipment. They do all their own security. They do all of that. I mean, to be able to have one that's just sitting there doing nothing, and it's like, okay, we have a port that we need secured, and we need to flesh it out. I mean, those are the people that you would want to call, from our military to accomplish those things. The absolute best option is to use these people, and they were just told, no, we don't. We're just leave them there sitting on the beach doing nothing.
That's basically what happened. Yeah, it was just shut up, sit down, and don't talk about this ever again.
All right, so I think Xandering just covered it well. I want to. Oh wow! So the U.S., which prepares for these things, and we spend essentially more than every other country in the world combined on our military budget. Our military budget is equal to or in excess of the military budgets of every other country in the world combined. And of the top 26 countries, 24 of them are allies with the United States. So this is how much money we spend on it. Now, part of that money is to have the preparations for, every reasonably conceivable battle already done. As you had said, we're good to go. We have the ability to very rapidly create a port anywhere in the world that we need it. You said earlier that we practice in the Arctic. We practice it, so if we need it and somewhere in the world, the Navy can build it for us there. So we can have a port, we can have barracks, we can deploy troops, and there are specialized units designed to build and or repair facilities very rapidly. They don't draw security from the rest of the military that's there. They don't have other resources, and you can deploy them and say, fix that. And they go and they do that. And they could have fixed this in about 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks, you say. And instead, it was given to a no-bid contract. It was given by no-bid contract to a company that took 6 months. Is that what for something we needed to successfully prosecute the war in Iraq? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think you have to clarify, though, it's not to prosecute the war, although it is definitely associated with that. It's to get humanitarian relief supplies in to feed the civilians in southern Iraq, who we know were already suffering, and particularly after the war, they really be in a hard place. Now, understand that the humanitarian supplies that were going in, while there were American supplies in other Western countries, the bulk of what was going to go in and was already ready to go was stuff that various Arab countries had already chartered ships for, loaded the relief supplies on, and they were waiting outside the Gulf in the Arabian Sea, waiting to come in when we said it was safe to do so, to go into Qasr and offload this stuff. And it would have been a really great thing to be able to go in and have Arab brothers helping their Arab brothers, that kind of stuff. It would have been a great international PR event, and instead it was just botched. Let's wait for 4 months before we can bring in Halliburton to repair the place. I don't know if it was Halliburton. It could have been Brown and Root. It could have been Pacific Engineers and Architects or what have you. There's so many different companies that do this kind of stuff. But I do remember that it was a company that was directly associated with Rumsfeld.
All right. So now you had said that there were 2 incidences that you could think of. That was the first. What was the other one?
Well, the other one, this was prior to the invasion, and they wanted to have some Iraqi, what do they call them? The Free Iraqi Army or something. And it was basically an exile group that had created this kind of paramilitary organization, and were, tied in with, CIA or some other organization. And the idea was that once the initial forces had passed, we wanted to bring in Iraqis who were friendly to us to police Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
So they needed to find a way to have them immediately available so they could bring them in. So the plan was to load those guys onto one of our amphibious ships who had brought our Marines over, and the Marines were now offloaded and doing whatever they were doing in Kuwait and getting ready to go into Iraq. So the ships themselves were empty. And they have all the berthing facilities and messing facilities to feed a fairly significant number of people. So they were going to put these guys on there. And the more we asked questions about, who's in charge of these guys? And there'd be this long pause. We'll get back to you. Okay. Are they going to have their weapons with them, or are we to, have the weapons delivered? Oh, they'll have their weapons with them, but you can put them in the armory under secure lock and key so they won't have ready access to them, which we would then turn to each other and kind of whisper each other, so they won't take over the ship, because these people had not been vetted. And these discussions went on for probably a week to 10 days about how we were going to do this. And then suddenly, out of the blue at the last minute, well, never mind then. And that was the last anybody heard of it. And honestly, I never found any mention of these guys going in again. So apparently at some point there was a free Iraqi army that we were going to support going in. And then the more questions that got asked, the more people were saying, this is some wild ass idea that somebody came up with. We don't know who it was, but I'm guessing I can tell you where it came from. And the more questions were asked, the more it was revealed what a dumb idea it was. So that went away. All of this keeps pointing towards things that the longer I was there, the more the planning went on, the more the post-invasion, post-war portion of everything was going on, the more evident it became that there really was no plan whatsoever of what to do after we'd won. So nobody thought about, should we provide security for public buildings like museums, water refineries, office buildings that are key to functioning of local areas, etc. And, as soon as we'd liberated the place, the forward forces drove on. There was nobody behind, and everything was looted or burned. There were reprisal killings right and left. Yeah, it was this kind of ridiculous notion of we're just going to waltz through and everything will magically become a democratic Republic of Iraq as we pass by. And the more we tried to point this out, the more we were told, shut up and don't look at the man behind the curtain.
Well, and they're going to throw flowers at us. Don't forget. We're going to be showered in flowers. I remember that one. And they're going to pay for it.
To be fair.
Yes.
At the end of Desert Storm, that's what it was.
Mm-hmm.
When we liberated Kuwait, throughout the Arab world, we were seen as just that, liberators. It was like, liberating Paris in 1944. For years thereafter, when you'd stop in Kuwait for an exercise or a port call or something, the Kuwaitis were very welcoming, very happy to see us. Not just them, but the other Arab nations for a period of time until we wore out our welcome. Were looking at us as, we're the good guys. We got rid of an evil person and freed Kuwait, and then it all went south. We basically burned all of our goodwill that we'd built up by that one operation. And this was all about, can I get the oil? Can I get money for my contracting friends, etc.? That's my opinion.
Well, so that's what I was going to ask about. So the Navy had really already had the ability to accomplish many of these things, and it was being outsourced to third-party contractors, some of whom I have to believe didn't have that kind of experience or training. I mean, the Navy prepared for this.
Well, sure, but it's not just the Navy. The same thing was with the Army. I'm sure that the Army was saying at some point, hey, why don't we send in some more MP battalions and brigades to police the rear areas and keep things secure? And instead they were told, no, we're going to have independent contractors take care of that kind of stuff. And hence you get Blackwater and all of the at best questionable, if not outright illegal stuff that they were involved in.
Our flirtation with a privatized, I do want to say, our flirtation with a privatized military was what Blackwater was, which was acute of Ayn Rand meets Patton. But yes, is entering.
Well, one of the things that kind of struck me when it was going on, because I was newly out of the Navy when this was going on, was we went through Iraq incredibly fast and subdued the entire country really, really quickly. Do you think that there was any of the issues with, were they planning on us being able to essentially walk right through the country with almost no resistance? And do you think that contributed to a lot of the back problems that ended up costing us a hell of a lot of problems later on, because it's almost like we went through too fast?
I'll say this, because I was involved, in Desert Storm stuff peripherally as well. When we did that, the army that we sent to liberate Kuwait was very, very, very much larger. And it was a huge international undertaking. People forget that there were, 2 Syrian, 2.5 Egyptian, Saudi Arabian divisions, French divisions, British divisions, Americans, and all sorts of different countries supporting the operation. It was huge. And we saw how quickly we overran a much larger army at that time. And I think almost every intel brief that I attended, it was almost the opposite of what you're saying. It was that we were going to go through them faster than we even did. That's what the prediction was. There were, things like the giant dust storm that slowed down operations and basically brought things to a halt for a couple of days that nobody had predicted. And those sorts of things that stacked up to slow things down. I think everybody knew we were going to get to Baghdad within a minimum of 2 weeks, and that's almost exactly what it took to get there. I think they may have hoped it would be faster. So I don't think that did we go so fast that we couldn't keep up with it from the rear area security kind of stuff. I don't think that's valid.
Oh, so when they were planning, they were actually planning that they could even go faster based off of previous experience of overwhelming force running through Kuwait. So they were expecting to go even faster, and then ran into some other issues that slowed them down.
Yeah,
I mean, it still seemed like how fast, from the outside watching, how fast, like looking at how fast we went through. And it's a bit different because Afghanistan was landlocked and there was no easy access to it versus Iraq. But I mean, the length of time it took us to go, the Navy to run through, and to get some of the helicopter operations going over there. And then we look at how fast they ended up in Baghdad and essentially toppling Saddam and having him on the run. That seemed very quick from the outside. So you're saying that they wanted, or they thought they would actually go faster, but then ended up kind of hitting on target for how quickly they got there?
Yeah, pretty much. This is an interesting anecdote. By the end of the operation, things had gone so smoothly that they had excess air missions that they were flying that they really didn't have anything for the guys to do. They put the aircraft up as on-call close air support or something. And one of the things that was going on is early in the campaign, they'd wanted to take out the Iraqi Navy. Not that there really was much of a Navy by that point, but they just wanted to make sure that they had nothing that could come out and shoot up the ships that were uploading all the logistics through the Kuwaiti ports. So those were a high priority strike target on the opening days of the operation. And one of the key targets was to take out Saddam Hussein's personal yacht. This was based on the belief that it was, and I'm sure it was a valid, that it was a kind of a headquarters command ship. So they wanted to take out everything that was associated with, the radios and computers and such that was going to be aboard that ship. So they hit it and took it out on the first day, but it didn't sink. So literally every day thereafter, they'd revisit the target and bomb it again, just because they wanted to see the thing blow up and sink. It was assessed as a technical kill. It was non-operational, and everybody knew it after the first day. But we kept revisiting that same target. And if you're in a war where things are going slower than you anticipated, you're not going to be devoting those kind of assets to a silly operation of that nature. You'd use them elsewhere. So they were going pretty much as fast as they had anticipated, if not faster. So I think that goes to what I'm saying, is that they knew what they were doing. They went in real quick and figured it would go that fast. And I don't recall ever hearing anybody say that the roads, which were the main supply routes, were backed up and choked, except through the cities where, again, lack of security forces covering those routes, those same MP battalions and brigades that I was talking about that ought to have been sent in, which weren't. That was the one holdup they had. You get the Jessica Lynch's unit that got ambushed as they were driving through Nasira. It's, again, because the frontline forces had all just kept advancing and they didn't clear the rear areas appropriately, in my opinion.
So, I'm sorry, it's probably not funny, really, but it is that my guilty pleasure is Baghdad Bob, who was that was my guilty pleasure, watching him go.
No, the Americans are nowhere near us. And that M1 tank you saw driving by the window, that's one of the ones we captured.
We are beating the Americans. They are not at the airport. They are not at the airport. Oh, dear Lord.
What a comedy act.
Sinister said we should have brought him back to America. Would have done well.
Oh, yeah, he could have done a tour in the Catskills and retired in splendor.
Well, I think he and Spicer would have been good friends.
Yes, very much.
We actually got that footage of Spicer. I should play that at some point. But the Spicer. As a treat for you, I'll see if I can cue that up for you, and you can see that. But So, anyways, all right. So, at this point, you're seeing this war is it appears as if it's being planned without having really been thought through, or at least thought through with the war in mind. But certainly, it appears to have been thought through with a political agenda.
I think the agenda is we need to go to war, and I think one of the key things you need to look at is Bush takes office in January of 2001 with a 58% approval rating.
Mm-hmm.
By August 2001, it has sunk to 51%, which is the lowest of any point in his first term. 9/11 occurs, and he announces the grand war on terror and immediately starts ratcheting up this whole, Saddam was in on it with the Al-Qaeda boys. And suddenly his approval rating soars to 90%. So I think this is a case of a administration that is weak on all other fronts, but realizes that it can, toot the bugle and bang the drum, and Americans will all dutifully lined up behind the president and the military because it's patriotic. And if you can do that at the same time that you're making some profits for all your primary shareholders and the people that are keeping your political re-election fund going, so much the better.
All right. So
I heard a lot of people talk about. Yeah, I heard a lot of people talk about the one of the things that they thought that was driving Bush was that he thought his father shouldn't have stopped after the liberation of Kuwait, that they should have pushed all the way into and toppled Saddam Hussein then, and was upset that didn't happen, and that this was kind of his chance to be able to essentially finish what he thought his dad should have done and didn't. And personally, I think that what we did for the Desert Storm was actually in line with what the United States' supposed and espoused values actually were, which is probably why it was, on the international community was so well received what we actually did and why we had so much support.
Right. Plus, it's also what the UN mandate had given us. It was only to liberate Kuwait. It was not to invade Iraq. It was not to institute regime change. Now, could the operation have been done in such a way that Saddam could have been toppled by his own people? Yes, I think it could have. Because one of the things you see is that the encirclement and disarming of the Republican Guard was halted before it occurred, allowing them to escape and allowing the regime to continue. Because you see enormous unrest after Desert Storm, all sorts of essentially what amounts to a small civil war in southern Iraq between the Shia majority down there and the Sunni majority, or excuse me, Sunni minority, the ruling Ba'ath Party, who were from the center of the country. And if you disarm the Republican Guard, there's a very good chance that they could have toppled him, the Iraqis themselves.
So, as you're seeing this and coming to grips with the reality, and you have been in the military for the most part all of your life, you've dedicated yourself to this, and you're seeing what strikes me at least as abuse of the military, at least to some extent, for political gain, which, by the way, and I wanted to, and I know since we had you on before, and it was a delightful show. It was delightful. We discussed the Ukraine and Putin and torture and murder and all this other stuff, but
all the good things in life.
Exactly. Yes. Did Putin really murder people? Oh yeah. Putin killed people. I was like, okay, good. So, but one of the things that you had talked a lot about politics of on Clausewitz and a few other things, and obviously a military really does serve a political end if it's in a democracy, and the reason is because it's the civilians who are making the decisions, and there are obviously political reasons for it. But presumably it's not to be used or abused as such. Obviously, again, even Operation Desert Shield had political consequences and was also a political operation, despite the fact that it was important for any other reason. So I don't want to. I do need to make sure that I'm not conflating and saying, "Oh my God, you were used by the politicians." All military is used by the politicians. But having said that,
absolutely.
There is an amount for which it's sort of understood and accepted, and it's part of how the system works. It's just a part of it, and then there's something above and beyond where it really is egregious. And it seems to me like you were starting to feel like it was egregious. So how did this affect you personally, having both been in the military, having been under you who've trusted you to watch out for their interests, and you're here, and it seems like things that would help the U.S. military succeed, help them accomplish their goals, and help them keep each other and other people alive. We're not being taken seriously, and we're being, again, please correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but this was being usurped to make sure that other people were getting rich, at least in some instances, as you've demonstrated. How did this affect you?
Well, one of the key things to understand is that when all this was going down, I had already submitted my paperwork to retire. And I was not surprised, but I was glad I was leaving when I did, because it was clear to me that something had changed. And that was further emphasized after all this was over, and I had returned back to my job with the Coast Guard at 𝐒𝐤𝐜𝐴DF West in San Francisco, and things were going on with that organization where money that had been allocated explicitly by Congress for counter-narcotic operations was now being subtly repurposed for what they would call narco-terrorism, so that you could use all that money, instead of interdicting drugs, to stop the finances that the terrorists were using by tying in with the narcotic smugglers. And I was seeing a lot of this going on where the intent that Congress had put on things was being, for lack of a better word, perverted by the administration to suit its own political ends and agendas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, it does. So let me ask now. So you were retiring. So it sounds like you were you were like, hey, I retired at the right time. But
Yep.
so now was that sort
So
of the yeah, please.
so I got out before the endless war began, and if you know what that is, that the term that people have used for the war on terror that dragged on for 20 years and technically isn't over. And you know the war on terror, when the Congress passed the legislation uh, allowing the use of military force to prosecute it, the wording of that legislation was so nebulous that we're still operating with that to commit forces to all sorts of things that really don't tie into 9/11 at all, but are using the same AMUF authorization for the use of military force that Congress had given for doing things like sending U.S. forces into Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm not even talking like Somalia or um, Kenya and such. I'm talking the other side as well, of going into Nigeria and Chad and areas like that. Yeah, it's become so commonplace now for military to be the first response to any international problem at the expense of trying to use diplomacy as even the first option, if that makes sense.
It does. I got to tell you, the first thing I think of when you do that is some schmuck who tried to use the Interstate Commerce Clause to pass universal health care. I don't know anybody on the in-time crew that has had any particular trouble with that, but yeah. Is Andrew any thoughts?
Yeah, it does seem like when you look at some of the responses that we've had to some of the areas, and it's like I don't understand what your goal is here. It's like, are you going to just use the military to try and solve every problem? In which case we're stuck there using the military. Because surprise, surprise, when you subjugate people, or at least if they believe they're being subjugated, they'll fight back, and so you end up with ongoing issues. Or do you want to stabilize the place so that you don't have to be there the whole time? It's like, we tolerate kind of bad people in power all over the place. I mean, and this was especially poignant in what the hell is that North African country? Libya.
Mm-hmm.
The leader that we disposed there in Libya, and I'm suddenly forgetting his name, Gaddafi.
Yep.
It's like, he even said, look, you're going to miss me when I'm gone, because you have no idea, what I'm keeping stable here. And when I'm gone, there will be no strongmen to keep everything in line. And we saw exactly what he predicted after we took him out. We saw that exact thing happen. And then you have to stop and wonder, okay, so what are the goals here now? Because they don't seem to be particularly clear.
I do want to.
I'll give you.
Please
Go ahead.
No, I'd rather hear from you. I have a question for Xander, but later.
Okay. I was going to say, this is something that I saw that kind of alarmed me, because, as I think I mentioned previously, I grew up in a, quote, diplomatic, unquote, family. And what has happened in the years from when I was a kid up through high school, and by the end of the time when I was getting out of the Navy, 30 years later, is that it used to be the American ambassador was the main point of contact for every government trying to do anything to do with the American government. And nowadays, the ambassador is kind of this little afterthought who's off in the corner, and you send your deputy underling to go deal with him. Every primary leader wants to go talk to the theater commander, the military officer for American forces that are in charge of that particular region that his country lies in. And I saw this happen several times. The emir of Bahrain, when the ambassador wanted to talk to him, he'd send a flunky. When Fifth Fleet wanted to talk to him, he went to go talk to Fifth Fleet. When the Saudi princes were, asked to liaison, they wanted to go see not the ambassador, they wanted to go see Centcom and that kind of stuff. And it extends to other countries as well, outside just the Middle East region. It's everywhere. And it's kind of like that old adage of when you have a hammer, every problem presents itself as a nail. Well, that's what's happening now. Every problem the country faces internationally, the immediate answer is to get out the big hammer.
Which, while the collapse of Rome was complicated, if I understand, was in fact one of the problems, which was they had such a large military, and they ended up, if you're going to feed them and if you're going to train them, you do kind of have to use them. You have to use them. Otherwise, you're not getting back any of the benefits for what you're spending on them, and you're going to collapse, and they ended up collapsing under the weight of their own military. But that notwithstanding, I do want to ask... yes?
Quick comment before you ask your question. This was one of the reasons why many of the founding fathers of the United States, Washington among them, did not want the federal government to have a standing army. Because if you're going to spend the money to train and house and feed a standing army, it's there, it's ready to go. You're going to want to use it and justify its existence. So there was an argument at founding when they were writing the Constitution as to whether the federal government would be allowed to have a standing army, and there was very heated debate over whether the federal government should be allowed to have that, or whether we should rely on the militia forces of the states to call up in times of national emergency, and they ended up deciding to allowing the federal government to keep a standing army because they figured that would take too long, and you could end up unduly burdening certain states depending upon how the states manage their own militias. So, they recognized this at the founding of our country.
Yeah, but at the same time, that standing army back then was tiny.
Well, yeah, but they expecting it to grow. They were expecting
no, not really. I mean, you look at up until the Civil War, the military in the U.S. amounted to, I think, 10 regiments total.
Right. I mean, they were expecting the country itself to grow, and one of the conflicts that they had between that coincision was if they needed to eventually allow the military to grow. It didn't for a very long time because, most of the conflicts we had were fairly easy to take care of and were more local. I mean, the War of 1812
other than the Civil
biggest thing we had to worry about.
Yeah, other than the Civil War, it stays tiny, and even after the Civil War, it gets demobilized down to tiny again.
And we stopped doing that.
Yeah, and it demobilizes after World War I. And to an extent, not quite the same extent, but to an extent it does it after World War II. It's only with Vietnam and what has amounted to a perpetual war since Vietnam that it's stayed enormously large, and I would put in parenthetically after that, and enormously profitable.
Well, so I do want to ask Xandring one question before we go forward, and then I want to finish up with, because I'm interested to know a little bit more about the effect it had on you, and we had sort of a question along those lines. But just because Xandring had made an observation earlier, and I wanted to ask him about that, because we are talking a little bit about nation building and successes or failures and third-party contractors. And you had made an observation that actually, if we wanted to nation build, and if we wanted to successfully help a nation recover, one of the things that we could not do would be to rely on third-party contractors. And I was wondering if you could just explain to me why that is for a second.
Because anytime you start adding lots of disparate interests and money into the equation, things become very unstable, and it's rife for corruption. It's like we have a Seabees battalion for a reason, and so if you're going to go overseas and you want to secure something and hold it and make it stable, it's like you don't introduce a whole bunch of essentially citizens, private people into this equation that are operating off of money. It's like this is one of the few areas where it's like government has an absolute role, and even if they're not as efficient as a privatized style army, I mean, there's one thing about Blackwater is they were incredibly efficient spending their money, or far more efficient than the United States military is. But you have problems with conflicts of interest and a lot of abuses going on. So you want to minimize that if you really want to keep an area stable, because you want to have a big unified force. One of the things about we had finally kind of gotten to the point of more or less stability in Afghanistan until we decided to leave. I mean, we hadn't had any we hadn't had any combat casualties in a year and a half. Everything was starting to settle out, and a lot of problems came from contractors going into Afghanistan as well, and now having to deal with all of these different things. It's like you're taking people out of the chain of command. It just makes them for a mess. So if you are actually interested in building up a country, like say you're going to go into Afghanistan, you're going to stabilize it, and you want to build up that own country, then you need to make sure that everything stays within the military. The military has all of the things that they need to do in order to do that, and you don't want to keep a bunch of civilian contractors to come in, because you don't really have control over them.
Well, and when the U.S. left, and when obviously we left and we took the contractors with us, Afghanistan collapsed internally. If we had been using locals, for example, to do a lot of that work, the money is going to Afghanistan. It's not going to the U.S., and we can't really have that. But then the U.S. can bail, and the country can survive, because we're not taking all of the people who manage the infrastructure with us, because we were doing it locally instead of outsourcing it, where we get to keep the money. Is that that was an argument I think you had made as well, which I thought was a point worth.
Yeah, it was one of the issues as to they were talking about, especially, and I made a lot of these comments in regards to the collapse of or what happened in Afghanistan, and our withdrawal from that. Because we wanted Afghanistan to have its own government. We wanted it to be, build its own nation and be stable and all that stuff, except, they pulled out and they're like, oh, well, we weren't expecting the army to just lay down like that. And it's like, I don't understand how you thought anything else was going to happen, because you made the army entirely dependent upon U.S. contractors to operate. And, it's like you wanted the country to be, to be its own country and not harbor terrorists and not devolve into chaos, kind of like it was in tribalism, kind of like it was before we showed up. And yet you didn't want it to be strong enough and independent enough and stable enough to operate without the United States, in order for it to make its own choices as to who it wants to align with. Because then they could tell us to go pound sand, and we're going to join up with China because they're offering us better deals, and that they would be stable enough to be able to pull it off. They wouldn't need us anymore.
What happened in Cuba? So we don't want to see another Cuba.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and since that happened, that's we tend to build up the nation, or that we're there, but we make them dependent. Their continuing existence essentially dependent upon them pleasing us, because if we pull out, they're just going to collapse. So anytime the people were saying, I heard on the news several times that they weren't expecting the military to have collapsed quite as quickly as it did. I mean, they were pretty confident it would eventually, but they thought it would last longer than it did. And it was like, no, I don't see how you could ever come to that conclusion, at least anybody who was actually dealing with that situation, because that, all of their military options were, military abilities were completely and wholly dependent upon U.S. contractors. And not even on, the military itself, but on our contractors that were, contracting to do a lot of their maintenance, to do a lot of their kind of back-end stuff that allows them to operate. And, we pulled all of them out. I mean, you saw all of the videos of their military on Skype trying to, holding up their laptops, pointing it at their jets, saying, how do we fix this? Because we pulled them all out. It's like, what did you expect was going to happen? So yeah, we should not be getting contractors involved.
There's an interesting related issue to that too, which is that internationally, when we try to talk to other people to join us in our coalition, if they don't immediately jump on board, we basically fling poo at them. And in this case, two countries stand out in my mind as perfect examples of that. One was Turkey. We wanted to send the 4th Infantry Division through Turkey, And the Turks said, no, we're not going to let you do that. And immediately it was like, okay, we're not going to be nice to you anymore. We're not going to, supply you with all the military hardware we've been doing. So we alienated the Turks, who used to be some of our strongest allies in the area. And another was Canada. Canada initially had been part of the planning for Operation Iraqi Freedom. And then for domestic reasons of their own, they backed out. But they said, once you've got things secure in Iraq, we would be interested potentially in coming in and helping you with nation building and peacekeeping. And instead, we basically said, well, you didn't help us, so we don't like you, and we threw them out, literally, and I'm not kidding when I say this, we literally threw them out of the room. We had a Canadian liaison officer at Fifth Fleet, and in mid-brief, when that announcement was made by the Canadian government, they sent somebody in and threw them out of the briefing room.
Jesus. Well, and that kind of, to tell you the truth, that's the attitude from the top down. I mean, freedom fries. We all remember that, and it's sort of like, I was humiliated to be an American when that aired, and people were talking about the freedom fries from Congress. And what was hilarious was one of the congressmen was just like, "What have the French ever done for the United States?" And I'm sitting there looking at the Statue of Liberty, thinking about this country and the fact it even exists, going, nah, I don't think they did all that much.
All the rest
without France, there's as many mistakes as France has made throughout the history of France. The United States wouldn't exist today without
for
the French.
Yep.
I mean, I don't think people quite understand the amount of support the French gave the American colonies to defeat the British, and that there was no way the American colonies would have done so. Yeah.
Yep.
The French were instrumental in stopping a lot of the naval power of the English. It's like, when somebody says something like that, you're like, you clearly don't have any clue about history, especially American history.
History books, what are those?
Well, don't get me wrong. I like to make fun of the French too, but I make fun of Americans. So I think I'm an equal opportunity offender. We owe a lot to the French. But okay, so you at this point, it seems like you've sort of reached a new realization about how there's been a massive change in how the military is being used. Did this have any impact on your politics? What you saw, what you didn't see, and did it affect you and your friends in any way?
Not really. I'd always been relatively liberal in my politics. I think what it did is created a certain degree of disillusionment. It was a case of, I put in 20 years or 25 years serving my country, and I'm now seeing the country engaging in things that make me a little skeptical that it was perhaps not the right decision at times. Because you start with this wide-eyed, innocent view of the world that, America are the good guys and the commies are the bad guys. And over time, you start realizing that, everything is a shade of gray. And I think what happened as a result of this is that I realized that it wasn't just a shade of gray, it was pretty dim gray.
Is there?
We weren't necessarily a lighter shade than the others were.
Yeah,
we kind of match.
Yeah, and occasionally go a little darker.
We certainly have the ability to compete with, any kind. People forget too. You take a look at Germany, World War II, and pretty atrocious stuff on the level of some of the most atrocious things our species has ever done. But if you look at how we treated the Native Americans and deliberately poxing blankets and some of the first use of actual germ warfare, we've
that is not a true thing.
It is not a true thing. All right. Well, you'll have to correct.
That is not a true thing.
All right. Well,
yes,
correct me
I will,
later, and we'll get into it.
All of that.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's all based off of complete hearsay from a secondhand information that was mentioned once in a letter home. There's no evidence to support that we actually did that.
Commander, I have to say this. One of the few things that really pisses me off about his Andering is usually when he says I'm wrong, he's right. Pisses me off. So
I don't normally come out with strong.
No, you don't.
I'll
you
usually
don't.
be like, you may be right, and I don't know quite enough. We can dive into this and we can look. I think you might be wrong. I know that's not my understanding of it, but let's look at it.
Yep.
And then there's times where I'm like, no, that's not a thing, and that's wrong.
Yeah, when he does this, I've learned to.
That's an area that I've looked into.
When he declares it like that, I'm like, oh shit, he's probably. I'm just gonna assume he's right because he usually so. That's good. I can learn something. I never learn so much as when I'm wrong. So thank you. We'll discuss that. So. Do you have any advice, Commander, that you would give to people who are looking into going into the military now, and how, if at all, do we solve this problem?
I would say approach it with a degree of skepticism. The recruiter will tell you all sorts of wonderful things, and 99% of what he's telling you is complete BS. The higher up you get, the more likely it is you'll see things that will disillusion you. Because I think the lower ranks are kind of insulated and isolated from the truly dirty elements of things that are going on. So
I can second that.
Yeah.
Did you?
I was in a slightly a little bit more unique position. I was an E5. But I was also a quartermaster. I worked on the bridge. I gave briefings and reports directly to the CO. We went to the wardroom many times to give the navigation reports. So I'm running around and interacting quite a lot with, the highest ranking officers on our ship. So on the one hand, it's like it allows you to be privy to some information. I mean, obviously, they're not just telling you all of the secrets, so there's a whole huge amount of stuff that we don't know. But just sitting in the wardroom, listening to what the officers are talking about while we're waiting, setting up for a navigation brief to pull into port, and some of the stuff that they're talking about, and you're like, okay, you guys are like on a totally different page than all of the rest of us enlisted people are. And, I don't think people quite understand, and especially how political it starts getting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I started realizing that once I made 03 and I was a department head, and you'd start seeing little decisions that were being made at times that you'd go, why are they doing it that way? And then the higher up.
Yeah, the fastest way to lose faith in our own military, despite its more or less track record of success, at least in purely military operations, is to get into the military and see how it actually functions.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Commander McMillan, thank you very much for joining us. I do want to make sure that we have a last word. So I've got a little something for you, but let's see if anyone has a last word before we do that, and then I would like to show you something. So, did you have any other thoughts or any other comments that you wanted to say before we head out?
No, I think we're good.
All right. And Zandering, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think that the power, reach, and scope of the federal government has become too large. It's doing too many things and spending way too much money to do them. And it's spending more time trying to enrich themselves and their cronies than it is, trying to actually take into consideration what is best for the United States as a whole. Which is probably why I'm still kind of sort of a conservative.
We should do a show on crony capitalism, because I think we were discussing that, and it's obviously not. There's a difference between capitalism as we have it and crony or capitalism as it should be in crony capitalism. So that's a good topic.
And
all right,
corporatism.
And corporatism, absolutely. All right. Well, so before we go, we'd been speaking about this, Commander McMillan, just a short while ago. There's been some controversy. I don't know if you tried to subscribe to this channel and join, but there was some question about the quality of our subs, especially compared to other channels, and it got into drama. It was really quite fierce, and we did try to get Baghdad Bob to come and talk about the problem and to help clear our image, but he was not available. So we got the second best. So here to discuss now with you the conclusion to our problems with our subscribers.
Hey, Nick, Sean Spicer. I understand there's some controversy brewing about how many subscribers you have on YouTube. You have more subscribers than anybody. Then it's probably the biggest, largest YouTube subscription that anybody's had. But also, it's not numbers that matter, Nick. And I know everyone's going to quibble over this, but it's content, it's quality, and your subscribers are amazing. They're great. They're high quality subscribers, and that's really what you have to look at. Don't just focus on the numbers. I mean, if people are spewing a bunch of fake news, just don't get in the mud. They're amazing folks. Their engagement, the way that they like the videos. Anyway, I hope this puts this to the end. I hope that this controversy is over, and we know who the real YouTube subscriber champ is, and it's you, Nick.
Welcome to In Time. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. We read all of your comments, and if you like this video, please don't forget to share.